We are less than a week away until the DLC. Oh, I'm so excited. As time goes on, I get more and more excited about the release of Shadow of the Erdtree. I'm sure we're all excited to receive our 18 inches of Mesmer, whether that be in-game or in real life. Jokes aside, I wouldn't be surprised if Mesmer becomes my favourite boss in the game, but he has a steep hill to climb if he's to be my favourite boss in the whole series. How steep? Well, let's look at the competition. Across 7 different DLCs from the Dark Souls trilogy and Bloodborne, there are a total of 24 bosses. 4 from Dark Souls 1, 9 from Dark Souls 2, 6 from Dark Souls 3, and 5 from Bloodborne. Fromsoft DLC bosses tend to be the cream of the crop for quality, but that's not to say there haven't been some stinkers sprinkled in as well. So today, we're going to rank every Fromsoft DLC boss from worst to best. Before we get into the ranking, please like the video and subscribe to the channel. Also, let me know what your ranking would be in the comments. Without further ado, let's get into it. Number 24, Erdtree, the King's Pets. It's tragically fitting that Dark Souls 2 is a game that gave us not 1, but 2 F-tier DLC bosses. Both for the same reason too. One of the dozen things you hear people complain about in Dark Souls 2 is the terrible runbacks. The main game alone could have a top 10 by itself, but the DLC is even worse. You'd think after the negative reception of the runbacks in the main game, they would hold back a bit for the DLC. Or at least the final DLC. Nope, they doubled down. Erdtree was likely the last boss they worked on, meaning they had the most time to develop the idea. If that idea was always reindeer land, they should have just pulled the plug. To add salt to the wound, these runbacks are usually followed up by a boss that could be considered mediocre, a cheap knockoff, a lazy design, another gank fight, or has stupidly OP status effects. Erdtree has all of these things, ripping off a boss from the exact same DLC, giving us 2 instead of 1, without any balancing factors. And when one dies, the other heals and buffs. This is one of the 2 bosses that outright offend me, because I'm being forced to part with my cash to get this type of quality in return. This is why I think that Erdtree are the absolute worst boss fight in this series, worse than the Bed of Chaos, because at least that fight didn't require you to pay extra money. Number 23, Gank Squad. 3 NPCs in a room, with poison statues, a terrible runback, and almost nothing to balance out the gank aside from hit and run tactics. You pay real life human money for something that feels like a Dark Souls equivalent of a Mario Maker custom level. What can I say other than that? The only reason this trash isn't the worst in the series is because the runback is shorter than the frigid outskirts. Literally the only reason. Number 22, Half-Light, Spear of the Church. It makes me feel so sad to have to put a Dark Souls 3 boss so low. But man, this fight sucks. Yes, I get it. Experimental boss design. Redoing the old monk fight from Demon Souls. The main game succeeded with redoing the Storm Ruler fight with Yum the Giant, but this is different. Archdragon Peak is a main game area full of NPC fights. And if you play online, you can do PvP literally anywhere in the world. So what actually makes Half-Light so special? It's not. The worst part about this boss is that it's mandatory to beat if you want to complete the DLC. That means you have to endure the same lengthy run back with an elevator, go past the same really tough enemy outside the fog gate, and wait 30 seconds for Judicator Argo to shut the f*** up so we can get the fight over and done with. Oh, and did I mention that Half-Light comes with not 1, but 2 Painting Guardians? One of the most annoying enemies in the original Dark Souls are in this boss fight, and if you don't deal with them, you can have a gank squad situation on your hands, but even worse because the Painting Guardians can heal Half-Light. It's a massive shame that the game with the best boss selection has a boss as bad as this. Then again, should we be surprised, considering the optional boss of the previous DLC? Number 21, Champion's Gravetender and Gravetender's Great Wolf. NPC boss with 3 dogs, and a big wolf when he reaches half health. This is one of the 2 bosses of this DLC, and it brings the quality of Ashes of Ariandel down so much. We face many wolves and giant wolves on the way here, and I already mentioned the NPC bosses in Archdragon Peak. We're getting nothing special here apart from the annoyance that naturally comes with fighting dogs in these games, alongside a parry-happy NPC that makes trying to attack this boss insufferable. At least the boss doesn't heal. That's something, I guess. Number 20, Blue Smelter Demon. Take one of the best bosses from the main game of Dark Souls 2, somehow make it an even worse run back, change the attack timing and damage types, and boom, you got Blue Smelter. Probably the most effort Dark Souls 2 made into a reskinned boss fight. The fight itself is an upscaled version of the original, only with magic damage instead of fire. But, I will admit, it's nice to have an optional DLC boss not be a gank for once. That's probably why I remember this fight so fondly. Even then, I can't ignore the fact that it's yet another reskin with yet another terrible runback used to add artificial difficulty. I do prefer the blue flames over the orange, but literally everything else about the original is better, which is baffling considering how bad the OG Smelter runback is. Number 19, Living Failures. The boss that everyone forgets about because it's between the two best bosses in the Old Hunters DLC. Basically, take the concept of Gank Squad, make it a little more original, give it some good lore, and we have this fight. I already talked about this boss in my Bloodborne Bosses Ranked video, which you should check out. I really enjoyed that one. So, I won't waste any more time talking about the Living Failures here. Number 18, Lawrence, the First Vicar. Another boss I talked about in the Bloodborne boss ranking. So, to summarise, amazing lore, great reason to do a late game Cleric Beast, good but overrated soundtrack, and an unfortunate case of Blue Smelter Demon syndrome. Just like Smelter Demon, Cleric Beast is better than Lawrence in every way, apart from the lore. This is why I place it higher than Blue Smelter. Also, the runback for Lawrence isn't nearly as atrocious, still one of the worst in the game, but a lot more manageable. I'm actually going to give a little hot take here. I think Phase 2 is easier than Phase 1, because you have a specific area to stay in to remain unharmed, and Lawrence is brought down to our level, making it easier to hit him. Overall though, still a disappointing fight. Number 17, Elana, the Squalid Queen. Finally, we're getting into some pretty good fights. The Velstadt summon is stupid, but everything else ranges from decent to good. The skeletons aren't too annoying, and the pig summon is funny as hell. Basically the Nashandra fight we should have got. The teleporting and fireballs keeps you on your toes, the scythe has enough range to be a concern, and we should mention that this is the first DLC fight of the game. As a way of introducing the unforgiving nature of the DLC bosses, Elana is the best pick for it. She showcases every hurdle you will have to jump over throughout all 3 DLCs, for better and for worse. The only thing ruining this fight is the Velstadt summon. He's a tough boss alone, and placing him in another boss fight with another tough boss, while there is nothing in the arena to allow for crowd control, it brings down the fight a fair bit. Number 16, Arva, the King's Pet. An original design, only one of them, a good runback, no OP buffs or healing. Yeah, Arva is far and away the superior cat boss. This fight could have been dangerously close to Sif from Dark Souls, owing to being a giant furry beast that someone has as a pet, and protecting their master's place. Luckily, Arva holds her own as a unique boss, opting for paw strikes instead of wielding a sword. The combination of magic and melee works well in Arva's case, and the fact that you can fight her while she's invisible spikes the difficulty. If you fight her while she is visible though, you're not getting off easily. She's fast and hard hitting, using an AoE attack if you stay close for too long. Every method you choose will have a counterbalance on Arva's side, making this fight a chess match of sorts, which is when Fromsoft are at their best. Seeing Arva this low is kinda tragic, but that just shows how amazing these DLCs and their bosses are. Number 15, Sin, the Slumbering Dragon. Case in point, Sin is the best boss of DLC 1 in Dark Souls 2, and the best dragon boss in the game. The story of the Crown of the Sunken King DLC practically centres around Sin, as he's more or less the cause of the state you find it in. This makes the build up for the fight constantly rising as you get further through the area. When you get there, the bonfire is thankfully outside the fog gates just after the Elana fight. Make sure you have repair powders ready, because Sin is a stone dragon, and stone really messes up weapon durability in this game. Combine that with the flame breath that includes a poison build up, and you have a fight for the ages. Don't be ashamed to summon for this fight, he's a toughie. He does tend to take forever when he flies in the sky, and that can slow down an already long fight. But for the most part, Sin is a pretty fun fight, and worthy of being a DLC boss. Number 14, Sanctuary Guardian. Taking a small break from Dark Souls 2, it took us this long to finally talk about DS1. I would say this is unbiased, but all opinions are biased. And I think Sanctuary Guardian is the perfect introduction to any DLC, even if there are first DLC bosses higher up on the ranking. Sanctuary Guardian doesn't need much lore, it just needs to kick your ass. And it does. Fast melee strikes, a poisonous tail, lightning attacks, and barely any breathing room between them. This boss makes sure you are fast enough to deal with the other bosses you will encounter. As the first ever DLC boss in this series, it's the standard setter for what players should expect when playing a Fromsoft DLC. No other boss could have pulled this off as masterfully as the Sanctuary Guardian, and it deserves much more credit. Number 13, Cyrillon. The prime example as to how a long, stupidly difficult run back can take away from the quality of the boss itself. It makes sense for the Elon lights to be there, but why are there so many of them? Why the hell are there fire frogs? Not to mention the time you waste watching a cutscene and a loading screen just to get into the run back. If they just put a bonfire before the fog gate, this would easily be in the top 10 without question. The fight itself is spectacular, easily the best in the game from a 1v1 standpoint. The attacks are fast but easy to learn. The room itself is the best in the game, and the only true downside to the fight is the janky hitbox from the grab attack. Oh yeah, and the music is tied for my favourite in Dark Souls 2. We'll get to the other OST later. Needless to say, Cyrillon deserved better, but he still managed to be brilliant. Number 12, Fume Knight. Combat wise, Fume Knight is on the same level as Cyrillon. In terms of the arena and the soundtrack, he's just a little bit worse. In terms of the run back, now that is where Fume Knight is far superior. Not far from the fog gate, and possible to go through without aggroing the enemies. Also, if you use the smelter wedges for this fight, it's well balanced. If not, then you got a hell of a difficulty spike. It's still possible to kill them fast enough for the healing to do nothing, but that means being aggressive in a game that typically encourages defensive strats. Phase 1 and Phase 2 are both tough but fun, and you can even skip to Phase 2 if you wear Velstat's attire, which is the kind of storytelling reminiscent of Dark Souls 1. Genuinely masterful stuff going on with the Fume Knight. It only misses out on the top 10 because there are just better bosses. Number 11, Demon Prince. The best gank fight since ONS, this basically took the exact same formula but added an extra step for more difficulty. Demon Prince might literally be the most unique boss in the series. Phase 2 changes everything depending on which you kill first. One has laser beams, the other has Thanos' moon toss. Dropping down from a great height to fight these demons doesn't get old either. And the fact that the arena is Firelink Shrine from Dark Souls 1 is just epic. This is probably the most forgettable DLC boss of the game, despite being such an awesome experience, which is very telling of the kind of bosses we have in the top 10. Number 10, Burnt Ivory King. It's very From Software that my least favourite boss in the game is in the same DLC as my favourite. Burnt Ivory King takes the aspects of why DS2 runbacks are terrible, and it adds those aspects into the boss fight. On paper, that sounds like it would be terrible, but in execution, it's a masterclass in boss design. I said Demon Prince might be the most unique in the series, but honestly that title goes to the Burnt Ivory King. Demon Prince's boss fight was based off another boss fight from a previous game, whereas nothing before or since has been even comparable to the Burnt Ivory King. Phase 1 starts off as a battle between two sides, the Ivory King's knights, and you leading your own knights. As time goes on, the portals are sealed by your knights sacrificing themselves. Then, Phase 2 begins, and the Ivory King turns up with possibly the most boss entrance in the entire series, along with the soundtrack that ties with Cyrillon as my favourite in the game. If there was a single boss fight I wanted to be recreated in Shadow of the Erdtree, it's without a doubt this one. Imagine leading an army into a battlefield, ending with an epic boss fight between you and the leader of the opposite side. Number 9, Manus, Father of the Abyss. This f***ing bastard was the first truly tough boss fight I've ever encountered, and the first to take more than 20 attempts. When your lore states that one of your most iconic bosses lost to this boss, you need to back it up, and Manus manages to do that. Velsat should take some notes. Nowhere is safe when you're fighting Manus. His arm has the reach of a 7-foot basketball player, his magic attacks are able to insta-kill the player, and he's quicker than a hiccup. If you took a Dark Souls 3 boss and put them into an older game, they'd be much like Manus. This does make me think that Manus might be a little too hard for Dark Souls 1. but at the same time it's less that he's jumped over the line, more like he's just teetering on it. Are there harder fights on this list? Absolutely. In fact, you could argue 6 of the remaining 8 bosses are tougher than Manus. That being said, few DLC bosses are quite as intertwined with the entire DLC like Manus is. Number 8. Sister Frieda. Arguably the hardest fight in Dark Souls 3, Sister Frieda is basically the one thing that made the Ashes of Ariandel DLC so good. Also, just like Manus, Frieda is intertwined with the whole DLC. The first and only 3-phase boss fight to have 3 separate health bars, you're going to be taken to the limit fighting here. Phase 1 is a tough but very manageable fight. The attacks are well telegraphed, the speed is so fast that you can't always get a hit in after an attack, the music is peaceful but haunting, and the arena is dimly lit with snow on the ground. Phase 2 doubles the fight as you take on Father Ariandel in a bigger space with the snow replaced with fire, and the calm soundtrack replaced with an intense one. Frieda is much more passive in this one, so the main focus is on Ariandel. Make sure you don't focus too much though, as Frieda can heal him, and they share a health bar, so attacking Frieda is also a viable option. The mastery in this fight is that you receive a Titanite slab at the end of Phase 2, but no victory achieved screen. Black Flame Frieda rises for Phase 3, and it's the most intense phase in the game. If you took Phase 1 Sister Frieda and maxed out the aggression, you'd get Black Flame Frieda. She seriously doesn't let up until she's defeated, and it's glorious. The reason why Sister Frieda isn't any higher is simply because dying in the 3rd phase is very likely, and doing so means you have to redo phases 1 and 2 all over again. It kind of makes me wish Black Flame Frieda was a separate boss fight that followed this one. Number 7. Black Dragon Calamite. It took Fromsoft a fair few attempts, but they finally got the dragon fight done right with Calamite. Compared to the future fights, Calamite is definitely more janky, but he's still better than most. His tail cut is arguably the hardest in the game, but it nets you a really cool weapon. The Flame Breath also has dark magic, which is capable of knocking the player to the ground. His clipped wing means he can't stay in the air for too long, but is still able to do a couple of attacks. And who can forget his Calamity attack, where he makes you receive double damage? Needless to say, while Calamite is a formula used for the future dragon fights, he still has quite a few unique aspects about his fights that make him stand out. His fight cemented Artorias of the Abyss to be an absolute home run of a DLC, and I think the best one to this day. Hopefully Shadow of the Erdtree can change that. Number 6. Orphan of Kos. If Manus felt like hitting a really high wall, Orphan of Kos felt like hitting the steep side of a mountain without any path to go around. Genuinely the toughest experience I've ever had in a boss fight. This terrifying creature gave me serious self-doubt. Fast and erratic, high damage, and lingering hitboxes. An incredibly aggressive second phase, Orphan of Kos as a fight was an experience like no other. I also love how this fight is both able to intertwine itself with the entire story, and also be a complete and utter surprise. We knew the name Kos from the main game. We also find out something terrible happened in the fishing hamlet, which led to the creation of the Hunter's Nightmare. But we didn't expect the final boss to be Kos' child. So seeing that cutscene becomes more disturbing when you realise exactly what's going on. How a boss manages to make you feel both sympathetic towards it and completely hateful as well is beyond me. I can't even say I felt good when I beat this boss. I was in a complete state of denial that I managed to do it. After so many failed attempts, was it a fluke? I guess I'll have to find out the next time I face this thing. Number 5. Lady Maria of the Astral Clock Tower. The front cover of the Old Hunters DLC is this boss. A fast, skilled fighter that seems like an easy enough fight to begin with, only to pull the rug from under you when the blood magic comes out. Only to pull the rug from under you again when it comes with fire. I can't even count the amount of times I died in Phase 3. Definitely more times than Phases 1 and 2 combined. You can see all the elements that inspired Sister Frieda here, but I think this fight is still better. Firstly, it keeps this fight to 1 health bar, not relying on shock value. Secondly, the story of Maria is basically littered all over the game, especially the Hunter's Dream. Thirdly, I think the fact that it remains a duel the entire fight is better than fighting Ariandel with Frieda in Phase 2. I spoke more about Lady Maria in the Bloodborne ranking video, so if you want to hear more, once again, check it out. Number 4. Dark Eater Medea. My favourite dragon fight ever. Dark Eater Medea is the culmination of all the dragon bosses that came before. We see elements of Calamite, the undead dragons from DS1, the red and blue dragons from Demon Souls, even a little bit of amygdala from Bloodborne. For a first playthrough, Medea is arguably the hardest in the game, but once you get the attack patterns down, he gets a fair bit easier. For me, that's the whole point of a boss battle. If the point is to get good, then surely a hard boss becoming easier once you learn it perfectly encapsulates that feeling. Even then, Medea is no slouch. I plan on talking about Medea a lot more when I get round to a Dark Souls 3 bosses ranked video, but I don't think there are enough hours in the day for me to talk about everything I love about this boss. Number 3. Knight Artorias. The cover boy for the Artorias of the Abyss DLC, and apparently the OG Dark Souls cover too. Artorias is a legend. It's kind of shocking that this is only the second fight for the DLC for that reason. Artorias is probably the most important character in DS1 next to Gwyn himself, so seeing him so early and in the state he's in builds up anticipation for what comes after. Like Medea, Artorias is a pretty hard boss for DS1 standards on a first playthrough, but gets exceptionally easier once you understand his attack patterns. Those attacks are still cool as hell though, and inspire future boss fights, including one we'll get to later. Alongside Calamites, Artorias is the only boss in the top 10 that doesn't have a second phase or extra attacks. When you get him down to certain points in HP, he'll buff and use an AoE, but you can stagger him out of it, making for a high risk, high reward kind of fight. Honestly, the only thing that keeps him at the number 3 spot is the fact that the other 2 fights tick every box for what I look for in a boss fight. Number 2, Ludwig the Accursed / Holy Blade. I don't really need to explain this placement, do I? I've never heard anyone say they didn't like Ludwig. I know he can be incredibly frustrating for BL4 runners, but the overall consensus is that everyone loves Ludwig. I talked about why I loved Ludwig in the Bloodborne ranking, and I don't think I can word it any better than I did in that video. So to summarise, the 2 best cutscenes in the game, the best music, Phase 1 isn't perfect, but it's still the best beast fight in the game. Phase 2 changes things up entirely, giving us probably the best second phase in the series, and the story of Ludwig is everywhere in the main game and the DLC. Having the Moonlight Greatsword was a perfect addition to the fight, even if magic's weapons aren't that good in Bloodborne, and I hope we see something like this happen in the future. Like, imagine if the Wolf Knight Greatsword returned in the Elden Ring DLC. I know it's not set in the same universe, but if they can do it with the Moonlight Greatsword, they can do it with other weapons. As much as I adore Ludwig, my number 1 is obvious. Number 1, Slave Knight Gale. One day, I will talk about everything I love about Gale, but for now, let's just address one comment someone gave me on my first ranking video. Gale is not like a Bloodhound Knight. His phase 1 combos are different, and the second and third phases have literally no resemblance to the Bloodhound Knight. Also, Gale's lore is a million times better, and his design is incredibly badass. Now that I've got that out of the way, let's discuss the relevance he has to the DLC. He's the final boss of the last DLC, meaning he's the final boss of the trilogy, and the final DLC boss up to this point. In a story with gods, dragons and primordial beings, the last boss is simply a slave knight that kills everything in its wake to find the Dark Soul. Knowing his mission guaranteed his death, he made sure the Ashen One was there to put him down. And that's the fight. 2 humans cursed at the end of the world, fighting over nothing and everything. The moment Gale realises his blood has the Dark Soul within, he hollows, entrusting you to take it from him and give it to the painter to create a new world. After he helped you with Sister Frieda and the Demon Prince, it only makes sense that you return the favour and help him with his mission. That's all without me talking about the fight, but that will be another time. Honestly, Gale is deserving of an entire video himself, and this video has gone on long enough. Let's just say it's very From Software for my least favourite fight and my absolute favourite fight to both be DLC fights. What would your ranking be? Let me know in the comments. Also, please be sure to like the video if you enjoyed, and subscribe to the channel for more. Until next time, my friends.